I don't know who's on the other side of that, but I'll be right back. All right. Well, looks like the webinar is open, so we are going to kick off. So hi, I'm Callum Ingram. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Nevada, Reno. And I'd like to welcome you to the December edition of Thought on Tap. Thank you for tuning in. Thought on Tap is a public engagement series brought to you by the Core Humanities program here at UNR, as well as the College of Liberal Arts and the good folks at Laughing Planet. The theme of the series this year is Rethinking. We've already had the pleasure in previous months of rethinking America, our tech overlords in academia. Today, we're going to be rethinking conservatism and conservative movements. And this spring, we'll be rethinking artivism, sports, work and money, and race and comedy. So please keep your eyes and schedules open for those on the second Thursday of the months to come. So being that we only have until 6:30 or so tonight, we'll see how, maybe we'll flex that a little bit. I'm going to jump into a brief set of introductory remarks on today's topic before welcoming our panelists and starting the conversation. Crucially, and I'll note this again later, while we'll start with me asking our panelists a few questions, we're going to leave hopefully 15 or 20 minutes at the end today for questions from you, the audience. If you'd like to submit a question to a particular panelist or to all the panelists, please do so through the Zoom webinar's Q&A function. So by way of introduction of today's topic, rethinking conservatism and conservative movements. Like most words with high political stakes, the only consistency across uses of the word conservatism is an inconsistency. Put 20 conservatives in a room, you'll probably wind up with 30 definitions of conservatism. I'll note that the same thing goes for liberalism or particularly socialism. Today, in good conservative fashion, however, my goal is not to try to figure out the one true, enduring, perfect, and abstract definition of conservatism, but instead to talk through the history, practice, and living tradition of conservatism and what it can teach us about the world. This approach is consistent with much of the work on conservatism in my own field, political theory, which often frames conservatism as a non-ideology or anti-philosophy, best understood in contrast to the dogmas of liberalism and socialism. To do conservatism requires turning to the wisdom of traditions and all their place-based peculiarities to guide action, rather than to abstract rules, utopian ideals, or universal projects that claim to transcend context and circumstance. History, to the conservative, is therefore understood as a valuable guide and a precious gift, worthy of care, conservation, and consultation. This is the case not just in matters of politics and government, but also in economics, religion, art, culture, romance, family, ecology, cuisine, athletics, pretty much every realm of human endeavor. And so while there's a variety of proto-conservatives and conservatisms that can be identified centuries and millennia ago, for instance, folks in my field love to argue, like, would Aristotle have been a conservative? I'm going to bracket those kind of nattering conversations by just sort of saying for now that conservatism gained its modern form as a set of responses to the French Revolution. The revolution, the story goes, sought to overturn traditional forms of authority and replace them with a new politics celebrating scientific administration, universal human rights, and the utopian possibilities of human perfectibility. The conservative response to the revolution sought to pump the brakes a little bit. What good, after all, are ideal schemes, folks like Edmund Burke asked, if they bear little relationship to the particularities of the place they're being applied? What of the habits, deep connections, and community values, maybe the informed prejudgments and ad hoc arrangements that form the backbone of our social organism? While radicals might be able to chop the head off a king or write a manifesto, that doesn't mean they know how to live life in a complex world. So all this impulse to draw from the wisdom of past experience as a guide seems simple enough. The real challenges come in practice. After all, whose wisdom is preserved? Which narratives of the past are we talking or not talking about? How do we distinguish between guiding lessons and cautionary tales? And how can the past guide us into the future anyways? These broad questions continue to shape a lot of intellectual conversations about the nature of conservatism to this day. However, if you want to move from abstract conservatism to an effective conservative movement, you've got to settle a lot of these questions. For people to act in concert toward a goal, it's helpful to establish a certain agreement about what those goals are and how to achieve them. By getting a lot of folks to work together over time, to work together over time requires exactly the kind of ideological commitment and consistency that's anathema to the Burkean conservative. Add to that the complication of trying to do this in the United States, a country literally founded by a revolution that it still deeply identifies with, and you've got a really interesting set of philosophical and tactical challenges. So in the United States, movement conservatism, as I'm going to be calling it, or as we might refer to it tonight, emerged in the form of fusionism, a term coined by then National Review editor Frank Meyer to denote the 20th century marriage, that's his term, marriage, of libertarian economics and social traditionalism. Meyer's use of the term marriage here is super meaningful. Libertarianism and traditionalism are two ideas that cannot be synthesized into one thing, but instead live in an unavoidable and productive tension. Capitalism disrupts tradition, tradition bounds capital's movement, but the two make a good match when they commit to one another and are strengthened precisely by their differences. This isn't like a romance novel, this is a marriage. So there's a long story to tell here about the rise of fusionism, its coronation with Reagan's election in 1980, its apotheosis and Clinton's pledge that even for the Democrats, the era of big government is over. Fusionism's adoption of conservative orthodoxy can't be separated from anti-communism and the Truman Doctrine, from generalized opposition to the civil rights movement, the interests of global capital, anxiety about women in the workplace and challenges to masculinity, soap opera squabbles among the National Review's editorial board, questions about cultural power's relationship to political power, myriad other forces. All of these are things you need to talk about when you talk about conservatism. But long story short, conservatism carries on. The anti-ideology that finds itself trying to muddle through the sort of same weird world that we all live in today. So will the marriage of libertarianism and traditionalism survive? Is divorce or polyamory on the horizon? And how far can one metaphor be stretched? For answers to these questions, I'm turning to our panel today. So I want to introduce folks. I guess you can wave when I say your name. It's got your name attached, but anyways, just want to make sure our audience gets to know you a little bit before I start posing questions. So first off, and he will be receiving the first question, this is a word of warning to him. We have Julian Zaudke. Julian is an undergraduate student at UNR studying political science and philosophy. His research interests are focused on private military contractors and political theory. He's contributed to multiple conservative political campaigns since 2016 and is active in conservative political circles on campus and around town. Also note that he's a fabulous student, as I've had, and he's a great friend to many of his peers. Seen this in action, really fabulous. Okay, next up we have Mark Pingle. Professor Pingle is a member of the Department of Economics at UNR since 1990, having received a PhD from the University of Southern California. Professor Pingle has published papers, books, and other writings in the areas of macroeconomics, behavioral economics, and experimental economics. Since fall 2008, Professor Pingle is focused on building an entrepreneurship program at UNR, which has fundraised over $7 million to support entrepreneurship courses and foster collaboration among community groups. with the aim of fostering economic development in Nevada. Also note, he was raised in a cattle ranching family, probably lifted more bales of hay and picked up more sticks than you've ever seen, but he's traded those in for guitars and pianos. So maybe we'll end with a song tonight. I did not. Okay. And then finally, we have Christina Ladam. Professor Ladam is a member of the University of Nevada, Reno Department of Political Science. Before joining the faculty at UNR, she received her MPA from the University of New Hampshire and her PhD from the University of Colorado. Professor Ladam specializes in American political behavior and political methodology, with her current work using an experimental approach to understand the ways in which formal deliberative events can promote beneficial outcomes. She's also a fabulous colleague, and I should have run this by you, but also you baked a really good pie for our department potluck yesterday that I'm still kind of ruminating on, so thank you. Anyways, so that's our introductions. That's me. That's most of what you're going to hear from me today. I want to hand it over to our panelists. I want to thank our panelists for being here during a very busy time of year, and also our participants in our audience for showing up. I really appreciate you being here today. So I want to start with a round of questions in the order I introduced the panel. But first, I'll note again, as questions come to you in the audience, please submit them through the Q&A so we can end our conversation with those today. So for the first round of questions, I want to ask folks a little bit about their sort of takes on the state of conservatism as it exists in the world today. And starting out with Julian, I'm wondering, so in your experience as a college student, what have you found to be some of your peers' preconceptions about conservative students? And like, what have you found in your assessment that they get right? What do they get wrong? Did they get anything right? Go off.
Well, I think what they initially get right is the fact that it almost seems contradictory, because you would expect that younger people would want change in society because they identify problems as they look at the people that actually run the country. Whereas conservatism is a longing for the past, or at least wanting to maintain the status quo. So there's an initial contradiction in young conservative. And that's part of why there's problems with preconceptions of liberal students towards conservative students. And there's obvious ideologue statements, such as branding conservatives with certain names or certain terms to devalue their beliefs. And that's just a minority. But the problem is that there are unactive political students that are influenced by their peers. And so when their peers are either on the right or the left, they are influenced by their beliefs. And if their friends are all labeling conservatism one way, they're going to believe that. And that causes, well, issues because they're not being portrayed correctly. On UNR, about a year or two ago, there was a problem with Turning Point USA, where they were presenting outside the Joe Crowley Student Union. And the liberal students came up and tossed their tables over and generally didn't engage in a civic conversation. And the problem with that is not necessarily that they're just stupid or anything like that. No, it's just a lack of understanding. And the larger problem with that is the fact that conservative students aren't willing to engage with their fellow liberal peers either. They come into college with their own preconceptions about college and liberals and professors, frankly. They view professors as generally being liberal. And I had a conversation with Professor Griffin this morning in the political science department about how personally he wants conservative students to express their beliefs and be successful. But the problem I told him was that you're a liberal professor in the eyes of conservative students. And so they're not going to trust you when you say you're going to judge them fairly. And that's a preconception that we have to fix with conservative students by just demonstrating with students such as myself, where I'm able to express my beliefs and do well because I can defend it well. And that's just where we need to go. We need to change preconceptions of liberal students, but also change the preconceptions of conservative students that only exacerbate the problem.
Yeah, I mean, I will speak to, in class you're vocal and you are thoughtful, and that is something that I think it challenges a lot of folks, sort of like you see like a brain scramble for a second here, like shit, now how can this guy possibly be, or be thoughtful and also believe something different than me. There's a kind of there's a deep confoundedness that's kind of it's precious to see in some ways and very important. I want to move into a kind of similar question, at least for Professor Pingle now. So folks often, and I guess this is sort of both maybe with reference to preconceptions that folks carry on campus very often in the kind of larger political discourse, but also kind of connects with the opening remarks a little bit, is that like folks often talk about conservatism as being nostalgic or trapped in the past. but like you're an economist, like you're in a field that's pulled into like partisan conversations about what we need to do right now and in the future. And so I guess understanding that kind of interesting position that economists are often placed in, like what is the relationship between the sort of traditional and laissez-faire kind of economic side, like the sort of socially traditional and the laissez-faire economic sides in contemporary conservatism?
Okay. What I teach my students is economics as a science is separate from, say, Democrat and Republican politics in this sense. The world works how it works. It doesn't work a Democrat way or a Republican way, a conservative way, a liberal way. And so I think one unifying theme in economics, separate from policy, and I'll explain why in a moment, is just the desire to understand when people interact, what happens? How does the world work? So we collect data. That's the fact or observation side, and then we try to explain what we observe. And so I don't think the politics or the perspectives, liberal versus conservative, comes in there. Where I think it comes in is to decide what to do, you have to bring in your values. And so I think what separates liberals and conservatives are those values. And then to get at your question where economics comes in, when I've thought, and I don't have the political science background that you all have, I skimmed Edmund Burke a little bit last night to try to remember French Revolution stuff because I vaguely remembered it. But when I think of the traditional conservatism, you're trying to conserve something. And your notion that we're conserving tradition, sometimes that's good, often it's very bad. And I do think the tension that you put, the laissez-faire capitalism, however you want to describe that, pushes back on that. What I would say modern conservatives should try to do is identify the traditions that are worth conserving. One element of tradition that's very valuable is it provides stability. If you think about common law and tradition, we know what to do in a given situation because that's just the way it's always been done. And there's goodness in that, but sometimes the way things have always been done are very bad and need to change. And so that's the bad side of conservatism. And finally, to bring in the laissez-faire, I think, and you hinted at this, a lot of modern conservatives, what they want to conserve is freedom. Economic freedom in particular, to borrow Thomas Jefferson. I know a little bit of quotes here. He talked about a free exercise of industry. He says that the first principle of association is the free exercise of industry and the fruits acquired by it. And so I think one thing that rubs conservatives is if you work hard and you obtain, and then government or other people just take from you, that's an injustice that rubs conservatives maybe more than liberals. And so we want to conserve that liberty, and I probably can comment more later, but I'll cut it off there.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely like the core of, I don't know, I'm on a Frank Meyer kick lately. I had to work him in there, kind of one of the founding figures in fusionism, founding figures in the kind of National Review image of that conservatism. And like, that was his line, is like, you know, virtue isn't meaningful if it's not freely chosen. And like, that's kind of the relationship for him between a lot of these sort of traditionalist values. Like, you have to have the space to be able to opt into being virtuous. And without that sort of choice and without rewards that are given based on that free choice, in some way, like, it's not virtue at all. It's, you know, you might as well be like a rock following the law of gravity, just falling down a hill or something like that. Absolutely.
Very good.
Yeah.
I'll have to read.
Sorry, go ahead.
I'll have to read him more. What did you say his name was? I think people in the audience might appreciate that too.
Yeah, Frank Meyer. He wrote this book, yeah, In Defense of Freedom. It's a super interesting. He doesn't get enough credibility in part because he like created the water that the fish swim in, so they don't really pay attention. But you know, and he's not quite as big of a personality as Bill Buckley, but interesting character. Yeah. Yeah, and anyways, yeah, and so I guess I want to maybe move to Christina, Professor Ladam. So you're a political psychologist in part by training, and you do work in political psychology. And so I'm wondering, like, what are your kind of, you know, putting on, you know, we're not doing like, you know, Freud or something like that right now. We're talking about a different kind of version of that. But like, what do folks in your field find to be sort of the defining traits of folks that identify as conservative? Like, what are these traits that, you know, kind of mark the conservative mind and conservative psychology? What maybe distinguishes them? And are these traits something that have been found to be fairly stable over time, or do they shift?
Yeah, so thanks. I would say that overwhelmingly, not overwhelmingly, but the majority of Americans would identify themselves as conservative. When we ask a basic ideology question, moderate is also like a modal response as well, but more people will say that they are conservative than liberal. That said, most Americans aren't ideological at all. So they aren't able to report a consistent ideology in terms of how it would map onto political views. So while partisanship looks one way, ideology doesn't map on. So in that regard, trying to figure out what does conservative mean, there's 10 to 15% of Americans who we could consider ideological. So as the previous speakers have mentioned, there is kind of the return to status quo, or, thinking of a good olden days that there is a desire to return to. But other than that, as it maps onto policy positions, it doesn't. So the vast majority of the American public, when you ask them about policies they want to see implemented, will take a consistently liberal approach. So I think trying to understand ideology in the American public is really difficult. And I'm not sure that it necessarily has a ton of value in terms of what it brings to political science, because it doesn't make sense. But the tradition of it is really constant. I was pulling up slides from when I teach political ideology, and the number of people who identify as conservative and liberal and moderate are close to straight lines over time. So it's a consistent mindset that people have, but I'm not sure what that means to people, what it maps onto. So yeah.
Reality tends to be fairly humbling for like us political theorists sometimes. We like to believe that these words and these ideologies, and we go back to our Burke and his reflections on the French Revolution and his the philosophical rigor, like, oh yeah, that's and then we can come together and reason about these things kind of in clear ideological opposition. It's like,
and those people are surely in the 10 to 15% of people who haven't consistent ideology, but the vast majority of Americans don't.
Yeah. Well, I have a lot of follow-up questions, but I guess, the follow-up questions actually that I kind of most want to ask is fairly closely connected to the one that I actually wanted to ask you next, Professor Ladam. So I'm going to kind of stick with you if that's cool. So like you kind of spoken a bit to the kind of conservative mind, or at least kind of conservative identity as it relates to partisan positions and policy proposals. But I guess the question that falls from that then is like, then what does that make the conservative movement? Like thinking of political discourse in the United States, this is a term we hear versions of a lot. It's something that is, it's again, kind of the water that the fish swim in, this idea that there is a conservative movement. But what is the state of this movement as political science, as a scholar of American politics, as the discipline as a whole kind of understands it? Where's the conservative movement at?
Well, I think it depends on who you're going to ask, right? Mm-hmm. And in American politics in general, partisanship drives almost everything. Mm-hmm. So partisanship, whether you identify as a Democrat or a Republican, and that is about 90% of the public can pick their party. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't map on to ideology. Mm-hmm. So where we're at right now in terms of the conservative movement as it relates to partisanship is we have the Donald Trump presidency that has a strong attachment. And then, the Lincoln Project, right? You have people who are Republicans, people on the right might call them rhinos, but they might also say that they stand for more of the historical conservative movement. So I think that there is a lot of inconsistency in terms of where the movement is going to go. I think there are a lot of things to wrestle with in terms of maintaining the status quo of a country that historically withheld rights from vast parts of the country and numbers of people.
Mhm.
So I think it needs to grapple with that idea. But yeah, I'm not a I can't say that I know what the future of the movement means, but I do think that it's in a stage of grappling with those issues.
Yeah, and I think, I'm going to push you on that a little bit more later, I guess, the sort of prognostication crystal ball side of things, probably, which I don't know. We can all, it's sort of science fiction, right? We get to kind of, we can speculate and have fun, but
well, the American public is largely predictable, actually.
Yeah.
And we see the ebbs and flows of what the American public wants in terms of policy outcomes. And we're a very moderate country. And, when we think of it in that way.
I guess, gosh, I'm going to slow my mind down, and I'm going to instead, rather than me asking all of the questions, I'm going to prompt folks again. If you do have questions, please do stick them in the Q&A so we can guide the conversation as we move forward, direct them to particular people, the panelists as a whole. We got some good ones coming in. And so, throw your lot in, absolutely. So yeah, I guess moving back to Professor Pingle, I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit. You work a lot with a group, the Hayek group in town. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to about Friedrich Hayek himself, and how this relates to how his work relates to your group's work in Reno, and maybe also factoring in some of the stuff that Professor Ladam has been talking about too, I guess, with the sort of relationship between political movements and sort of ideological movements or something, and kind of how your group situates in there.
Right. I would say Friedrich Hayek, along with Milton Friedman, are two well-known economists, well-known for more than just this, but especially well-known for explaining why freedom works, and maybe why moving too far away from that doesn't work. If you take Friedrich Hayek's Road to Serfdom, he basically was talking about Hitler's rise to power and moving away from freedom. And as you do that, you'll end up with tyranny and an economy that won't work too well. The basic reason for that is markets extend cooperation. This is a Hayekian idea. If you have to know everyone to coordinate, then relationships actually can mess things up pretty badly, in that, oh, I don't want to cooperate with you. You're not of the same religion. You're not of the same race. But if all I need to know is the price of your product and it's better than the next person, I don't care your race or your religion or whatever. And that's only part of the reason cooperation extends. So Friedrich Hayek would say it's not merely a choice, it's a mechanical thing, that freedom simply will work better. And then if you take somebody like Bastiat and you add it to that, freedom is fair. We bring in externalities. So when you mentioned laissez-faire capitalism, some people would interpret that as no government. Well, you need government from Hayek's point of view to define and protect property and property rights so that people then know what they own and can trade. But then also when people are left free, they can injure others. And so still a proper role for government, I would say from a Hayekian conservative point of view, is we have to manage all that. So crime is obvious, but then not crime. It's just I incidentally hurt you, but I do it badly. And so how do you manage those situations? Bringing that to the Hayek group, there were a group of business people in Reno who, after an election, felt freedom was underappreciated. They just started meeting once in that month, and it grew. And a person eventually formalized it. So at the Hayek group, the specific mission is promoting freedom and prosperity in Northern Nevada through education. We just have monthly dinner meetings, a wide variety of topics, actually some, you could say, liberal speakers on topics. So it's not simply a conservative preaching to the choir thing. But about 4 years ago, we also took on financial literacy as an outreach, and we've raised hundreds of thousands of dollars, put financial literacy curriculum at about 25 Northern Nevada schools, a site license for Washoe County School District. Why do that? The idea is you're more free if you can manage your finances. About 50% of divorce, well, about 50% of marriages end up in divorce. And about 50% of marriages break up because people don't manage their finances well and end up fighting over that. And so it's a very eclectic group. Just one last thing on this, our speaker December 16th, if people want to go to the Hayek website, you could just look up Hayek Group Reno, is a guy named Peter Klein. He's from Baylor. He's associated with the Mises Institute. So there's a Hayek, von Mises was Hayek's advisor. And he will speak to just entrepreneurship and innovation as a driving force in society and why you need freedom to have significant innovation. So it's an interesting, eclectic group, a good place to network if you're into that, but a good place to learn as well. And you're muted. There you go.
Yeah. I started thinking about questions ahead, and then I started, didn't even click to started going off. But yeah, I mean, I think for one, I mean, the idea, the financial literacy divorce thing, I mean, that's that kind of an interesting, that starts getting into, again, going back to the image of the marriage between traditionalism and libertarianism and how acrimonious that divorce could end up being, perhaps, if it ends up happening, and then who gets the house in the end and who's got the kids, I don't know. But again, how far can the metaphor be pushed? We'll find out. But it's, super. I'm gonna have to start. I honestly just found out about the group, and I'm gonna have to, they sound like a really, really cool kind of.
I'll pay for your dinner December 16th if you want to come. It's cool.
I'm not far enough outside of grad school to turn down free food under any circumstances. So look out. Cool. So I guess, Julian, kind of picking up on this conversation a little bit, but also maybe kind of at the risk of making you, picking up and like making you speak for the youth too much, what are the hello fellow kids? What do you see as some of the positions that are kind of emerging to bind younger conservatives together? And what do you see as kind of also being some of the more conscientious not conscientious, but contentious and controversial topics among younger conservatives that might mark changes in how conservative identification might like realign in the future, with obviously Christina's point that like things are relatively stable in America in general, kind of in mind, I guess. But yeah, what are the young conservatives up to, and what are they fighting about?
Well, I think as Professor Ladam was mentioning earlier, there's a lot more differences than there are similarities between all the people that may classify themselves as conservatives. But in terms of what unites them, I think the most obvious and most contemporary one is tech corporations, mainly because of the issues of freedom of speech, as well as mainly just Trump being banned off of social media. That was a big spark for conservatives, especially young conservatives, to start being worried about tech corporations. But probably more similar to what we would expect from conservatism is family values is still very important to young conservatives. And that's pretty self-explanatory. But what may be almost in contradictory is the fact that icons are very important to young conservatives, which almost seems contrary to the idea of maybe rugged individualism that conservatives kind of try to express a lot, but they feel the need to latch onto an icon, whether that be Reagan, whether that be Trump or Lincoln. But that's when we start getting into the divisions. There is, with all Republicans and conservatives, and especially young conservatives, there is a worry about Trump's influence on the party, and they would rather go back to this golden age of Reagan conservatism But then there's I would argue, a larger sect among young conservatives towards this Trump right-wing populist ideology. But I think that's when we start moving into the concerns of social issues that are unique to young conservatives in comparison to older conservatives. What a lot of people don't realize is that Trump was the first president to enter office openly supportive of gay marriage. He was open about it, and frankly, he just maybe didn't care. But that is pretty significant for conservatives. And so what you have going on there is this division on social issues. A lot of that originates in religion. Not many young conservatives aren't as religious as older conservatives. And so that creates a problem of having to justify their beliefs without religious arguments. You also have the issue of minorities in the party. That is a growing phenomenon. There was a Wall Street Journal poll that came out yesterday that Hispanics are now evenly divided between the two parties, which is significant. Maybe it's because Democrats have taken Hispanic voters for granted. But either way, there's a problem with minorities entering the party because it causes an identity crisis for these minority conservatives, because there are older conservatives as well as a history of conservatism that isn't friendly to minorities. So that's something that has to be addressed on almost an individual basis. But I think is even more contentious is LGBT issues. Homosexuals and bisexuals are being more accepted in conservative youth than I think in any other generation of conservatives. And it frankly doesn't seem like a problem for even some of the older conservatives. They seem to be embracing it because at least there's more younger conservatives. But I think when we start moving into more contentious issues such as members of the transgender community, it starts getting tougher. Many conservatives, younger and older, are not willing to accept transgenders. It's a hot button political issue. And frankly, it's not something that conservatives seem that like they're willing to compromise on. But all of this ends up culminating in is an identity crisis for young conservatives. They are more liberal on race issues, some even going as far to actually support Black Lives Matter and other issues. But at the core of all of it, they're having to grapple with the fact that maybe they don't fit what people actually view as a conservative, such as myself. I'm a Hispanic student, college student that is a conservative, and that seems contradictory in itself to many people.
Oh yeah, I think that's, there's been so much ink spilled for sure. I think particularly, not just in conservative circles, but kind of all over the place. And yeah, it's sort of like what will become of like the sort of evangelical right, which has often been, at least for a long time, sort of understood as like a sort of mobilizable base you can kind of depend on in primary elections or something like that, or that holds a lot of sway in the party. And yeah, what happens with a generation of folks that don't have necessarily that same kind of set of connections to both a particular form of community, like the church community, but also to a particular tradition and particular sort of social values. I think it's going to be a really interesting thing to watch that space about for sure.
Yeah, and I think
can I comment on that real quick? May I comment on that real quick?
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
I think the libertarian brand of conservatism allows a reconciliation there. I think many who have very strong faith understand that they wouldn't want another faith that they don't accept pressed upon them. And so I think they can separate the faith that they would pass to their family and the values that they would pass to their family from forcing those on others. So a basic question is, what should you be willing to force on others? And it's not necessary I may not think homosexuality is right, or transgenderism or whatever, but why should that matter if I employ you? It has no bearing on your productivity or whatever. And so I think the conservative movement has moved a long way toward that perspective. Even people who are hardcore evangelical, they're not interested in pushing their religious values on people. They're more interested in a world where their religious values aren't pushed out the door. And so they actually are willing to embrace a wide variety of people, because I think there's more of a recognition that if you're going to push one way, people can push back the other.
But I think that's an important caveat is a lot of the times when people view, say, these divisions in conservatives, where it might be disdain or maybe just not full approval of certain groups, that's often associated with just originating from hate. And that is a misconception. The disillusion with, say, certain LGBT groups or certain social issues, I don't think originates from hate, but rather from the focus on family values. They still value the family and they see these as either threats to the family or just things that aren't traditional to them. And I don't think it comes, and that's an important caveat that I think liberal students need to remember, is it doesn't come from hate. Although you can still find hateful people, it's not always, and for the majority of people, it is not.
Yeah, I mean, this really gets to, so I guess I'll move on to the a last question. We'll kind of do a quick round of answers to that and then turn it over to some really great audience questions that have been coming in. I'm really stoked on these, and we could stick around for a few hours and answer them. But yeah, I think, a lot of the really initial conversations, kind of going back to, 50s and 1960s and the kind of emergence of this movement, there was such an anxiety that if the libertarian strain ends up winning out over the traditionalist sort of strain in conservatism and kind of American sort of, if ultimately libertarianism kind of trumps conservatism as the sort of core commitment of particularly the Republican Party, that would undercut the sort of ties of community, that there's something about the free market that kind of inherently undoes the sorts of connections and attachments that are so essential to, somebody who already, Jim and his questions already bringing up Tocqueville, those sort of deep-rooted connections to one another that are essential to democratic functioning. Kind of worry about a kind of rootless, atomized, economized society actually destroying the sort of bedrock of democracy and national identity. It was something that is one of the reasons that Russell Kirk was angry at everybody in the 1950s and 1960s, because that was his sort of big anxiety with all these dang libertarians coming and calling themselves conservative. I don't know, there's a lot to get into there. Anyways, okay, so I want to ask one last question at the risk of making folks prognosticate a little bit too much, pretend to be, punditry is, I don't know, I find punditry tedious, but I'm still going to do it, and then ask people to do it a little bit. I just kind of want to ask all of our panelists the same question, which is what, and we sort of got to this a little bit, but what do you think the future holds for conservatism in the United States? I think, and I guess I didn't really pick an order, but if we go, let's say Christina, Mark, Julian on this, I guess, what does the future hold? What do you see in the crystal ball?
I think it's going to largely depend on what we see in the next election, at least on the political science side. I think President Trump has made it pretty clear that he is going to run again. And the more that the Republican Party dominates around Trump, I think that is it does present kind of an existential challenge to conservatism, because Trump doesn't align with so many conservative values. And I think that could prove problematic for the movement moving forward. Other than that, I started out saying this country isn't ideological. So I'm pretty confident that the 10% of people who identify as either liberal or conservative won't change that much. Partisanship runs the day in terms of elections and how things play out. The movement in general, I think, does need to figure out some identity questions for themselves in terms of what types of rights that are wanting to be pursued. If it is a more libertarian push towards freedom, then that does need to reconcile with some of the social issues that are kind of in conflict right now. The cases before the Supreme Court right now, from where we look, the conservative bench is going to go, are going to be stripping freedoms from people. So I think there is kind of an existential crisis in the movement, and I think the next election will tell us how things turn out.
which is, I think, particularly important because, yeah, so many of these conversations have to do with voting rights too, right? And so it's going to be not just a chance to sort some of these things out, but it's going to be a chance to sort of see how a lot of these partisan kind of pushes by a lot of particularly sort of Republican state representatives, or secretaries of state, governors to restrict voting rights will actually impact folks' capacity for democratic participation.
and what districts look like after the census. So yeah.
Yeah, it's funny. Everything is changing and everything is staying the same. That is basically political science's like analysis of most everything, from what I can tell. That's why I love our field. I don't know if Mark or Julian, one of you want to jump in a little bit? Or I guess Mark, you've been muted.
Sure, I'll quick. I think there are two perspectives. There are the ideas, and then there's the next election. I think the next election bodes very well for conservatives because of a number of events: Afghanistan, the border, the rule of law in the cities, homelessness, all of these things. I think from the average person, a more liberal approach has not worked. So I'll mention that. But then from the idea perspective, I think there will always be a liberal conservative bent because there's a more government versus less government bent. There's also a family as the core unit in society versus a broader government allegiance kind of bent. And there's a freedom versus individual freedom versus not going, to the federalist, anti-federalist kind of thing. So I think both of these perspectives are healthy for the future. The last thing I want to say is for our nation, I think what's most important is that people can change their minds. They can listen to something like this and say, that Mark Pingle guy's an idiot. And so I've become more liberal because everything that came out of his mouth was really dumb. And so as long as we can discuss these things and get, and we're adaptable as individuals, and if we're not adaptable as individuals, as long as we can keep adapting as a nation, I think that's really the most important thing for political success. The failures are North Korea, Cuba, Russia, China, where there's such a dominance that you can't change. Go ahead, Julian.
Well, I think what's going to drive most of the change is the fact that fiscal conservatism is on the decline. Since the Reagan era, it's been on the decline. And frankly, it's in 20 years or so, I doubt it's going to be present in Congress or policy much at all, besides maybe a few loud people, like a new version of Rand Paul or something. But beyond that, I think this conflict between the Reagan era Republicans and Trump era Republicans, I think the populists will pull out and take over the party. And I think part of that is because the rhetoric is so strong. And because fiscal conservatism is on its way out, these more populist social ideas where basically welfare is becoming more acceptable for conservatives. But it's with a caveat. It's welfare for the American man, not the illegal immigrant or the other. And so that's where a lot of that's going to come from, is that change of fiscal conservatism is going to drive the rise of populism. But what's also going to happen, I think, is we're going to enter an era of Republican politics. It's, at least in terms of the presidency, there's usually periods of Republican presidents and Democratic presidents. I think Trump, although he failed to get a second term, I think he's a transitional candidate for these more populist Republicans. And I think eventually we will get a stronger and probably more influential populist Republican. And what's going to drive that is the fact that minorities such as Hispanics are increasingly joining the Republican Party and conservatives. And on top of that, Democrats just aren't that great at legislating or getting their goals done as conservatives are. Conservatives who seize the Supreme Court, when they're in Congress, they're usually more effective in most measures, whereas Democrats are struggling a bit more or unwilling to make changes that they say Republicans are blocking, when in reality, they really aren't. It's themselves. But I think that's just where we're heading towards. It's going to be this conservative age of politics in the next 10 or 20 years.
I think we've got some really good follow-up questions actually from the audience on some of these themes. So I'm going to turn it over to, I think we've sort of gotten toward Amanda's question, but I maybe want to get Christina to maybe reaffirm an answer to it, or sort of reframe that. Maybe that'll kind of connect with some of this prognostication stuff. So like Amanda asks, Do you feel that the RNC's policy preferences fit under or align with the ideological label of conservative? Do conservative preferences fit under the partisan label of Republican, or is conservatism much more than just an ideology or policy framework?
Well, it's hard to evaluate that because the Republican Party didn't issue a platform in 2020. They maintained their 2016 platform. So the majority of their platform goes off on Obama. And so the Republican Party under Trump, I think we see a lot of leaders of the party not sure how to handle the situation right now. And we did see multiple failed candidacies of more moderate Republicans, right? We watched John McCain lose. We watched Mitt Romney lose. And then Trump wins. So I think a lot of Republicans are thinking that that is the model to follow. I don't, it's really hard to say whether a party can map onto anything. I think the people who are in charge are setting the agenda, right? And so Trump, 4 years in office, he set the agenda for the Republican Party. And now we are, until another Republican is elected, Trump is still kind of the head of the party. So yeah, does it map onto conservative ideologies as we would think of them? No, but Trump never did, right? So it's hard to know, is Mitch McConnell, is he who we should consider the head of the party? Or yeah, I think it's difficult to say, but if they had released a party platform, that would have been more helpful.
Yeah, I mean, it is a really interesting thing. I mean, most parties when they lose a presidential election, like I remember was it Romney? They did like the post-mortem, like we're going to take the corpse of the party out, and we're going to like poke it and prod it with sticks a little bit and try to figure out what's not working in there. But I mean, I recently had a long conversation with sort of a Republican gubernatorial candidate who just insists like, that there's no post-mortem to do. The party doesn't need to change because they won. It's just a fraudulent loss. They need to double down on this kind of particular, 90% of votes in Nevada were for Trump, according to this guy. And like, that's what you think. Yeah, I guess there's no real reason to edit what you got, right? But yeah, I do think that, some of the points that we've gotten at least is that, Trump does represent a really interesting shift in the party in some ways in terms of like, yeah, how do we think about fiscal conservatism, the nature of money, where it comes from, how we use it, who ought to benefit from it, how. And Julian's point also about, yeah, like kind of the rise of maybe like a certain version of wealth, like welfare, or I don't like the word entitlements, but I'll use it like entitlement conservatism or something. What does that start looking like? I guess, well, I've got a couple of questions that I really like, but I think I'm gonna ask one that's kind of on a pet question of mine before moving down. This one's from an anonymous attendee, and then maybe I'll ask Dave Rondell's question. But the question, you'll see it up in the queue, is with all the science available, why don't most conservatives at least believe that climate change exists, let alone work together on climate change policy? I think this is a really interesting question, in part because it's philosophically interesting, it's logistically interesting, it's interesting in terms of partisan politics, coordinating economic actors. Climate change gets at everything. It's a juicy one. And so I guess I want to maybe throw it out to, I don't know who on the panel would like to sort of respond to this, but what do you see as a kind of conservative response to this very new kind of issue that is of urgent global concern, assuming you believe the science, which if you don't, that's your problem. But like at this point, Okay, anyways, so I guess, I don't know if folks would want to jump in a little bit.
Speak to that, Julian? I'll let Julian go and then I might comment.
Yeah, I think it goes back to the preconceptions. You of course find some conservatives that genuinely don't believe in climate change just as you can find some conservatives that think the vaccine gives us Bluetooth signals in our arms. You're going to find some more extreme people that maybe don't listen to all the science or all the facts. But most of the debate with climate change, for conservatives at least, is not whether climate change exists, but rather to the extent of that we're causing it, or more philosophical questions like, what can we even do about it? Conservatives will point towards, well, look at China, India, and Russia. As we've decreased our carbon emissions, they've just significantly increased theirs. So what's the point of us ruining our economy? And that's something they'll point back to as well, is especially probably why Hillary lost Pennsylvania in 2016, talking about shutting down the coal mines. Conservatives are taking this blue collar stance, protect the jobs, as well as just kind of defending why should America have to suffer in their eyes economically if we implement policies that combat climate change. But I think as we transition towards this populist Republican era, you might start getting more people that care about climate change because they'll start viewing it as a threat to America's national beauty. I've started seeing that in some conservative circles where they have this pride of American natural monuments. So I think there might be at least some change in the future in terms of conservative perspectives on it.
Yeah, I think that's good. What I'll add, there's a guy named Bjorn Lomborg who actually has, I think, economics background. I forget if he's from Denmark or Sweden, but he's an interesting guy who I would say has a conservative view on climate in that he accepts that there's warming. I think it's more questionable about whether that's dire. In fact, it is obvious if you look at the science that there are benefits to more carbon dioxide in the air for plants, for example. I think many plants will grow better with 5 to 10 times the carbon dioxide. And so the question is more of an economic question if you look at Bjorn Lomborg and others. So I think maybe a conservative position that's evolving is not denying whether there's warming and there's rising water levels, especially in certain areas. But the question about what to do about it, here's an interesting thing. There are trees in both Lake Tahoe and Deer Lake above Lake Tahoe, and those lakes had to be way lower than they are today in order for tree stumps to be in there that are hundreds of years old. And so we know that way before human beings started emitting carbon into the air, there was significant climate change, and we adapted to that. Why not adapt to this rather than accepting huge costs? And so where I personally, what I'm very much for is the kinds of research in electrical energy, solar energy that can move us in that direction. But I think a conservative position is to take all these drastic actions that have been proposed when we don't have much certainty on the effects of the warming is not smart. It's just an economic trade-off. So it's not a science trade-off.
So some of the research I've done, this really speaks to affective polarization in this country, where the better educated, I shouldn't say better educated, educational attainment has a different effect for Democrats and Republicans in terms of climate change beliefs. So people who have more educational attainment who are Democrats are more likely to agree with the scientific consensus, which is overwhelming that we are causing this and we are doing this. And Republicans with greater educational attainment are less likely to endorse those views. So it's just a striking example of affective polarization and motivated reasoning, where people are motivated to reach that conclusion based on their partisanship. And that's what we end up with. And media consumption has a very similar effect. So people who are consuming more liberal news are more likely to endorse climate change beliefs held by scientists. And Republicans who consume more media are less likely to endorse those views. But most of these views are vastly held by.
What are the beliefs though? Are the beliefs simply that the climate is warming and that we're causing it, or are the beliefs that we should do something about it?
All three.
Because those are different in my mind. Yeah.
It's all three actually. So the climate is warming, it's caused by humans, and we need to act immediately on it. And all of those are vastly held by climate scientists. And I'm not a climate scientist, but those are almost universal opinions taken by the scientists who study it.
Well, I would say doing something about it is not a scientific, that's a policy choice, and that's where you bring in values. And that's why it's not a science matter. It's a science matter. Is the climate warming, and are the seas rising? And it's a climate matter to model what might happen, but it's a political, social science matter in terms of what to do about it. So the climate scientists may have their opinions, but their opinions are no different than a psychologist on whether we should do something about it.
This gets into all sorts of very interesting conversations that really aren't really ones that we're talking about too much nationally just yet, about like the role of technical expertise as it relates to democracy, right? And like how does these decisions ought to get made, whose voice, and how we ought to weigh certain maybe prescriptive propositions against one another based on who's speaking them and what kind of information they have, and what is that relationship between science and politics. I guess I'm gonna ask one last question that tries to tie together quite a few of the questions, and it's not going to be great. Because I'm trying to tie together like 4 or 5 questions that I think are all fabulous in their own right. So like, kind of building off of the question from David Rondell, like the conservatives and liberals, I'm just going to turn this into like a real pig's breakfast. I'm also going to say, Republicans and Democrats, like they disagree on all sorts of policy questions. And I guess, this connects to maybe, Stephen's question on like arguments about what the nature of freedom is. Like Marx understood himself to be a philosopher of freedom. Democratic theorists do, conservative theorists do, economists do, sociologists do. There's so many different understandings of freedom. There's understandings of the role of government that are deeply, deeply rooted sources of like conflict, partisan identity, ideological identity, things like that. And so like, I guess I'm just wondering, like, to build on like the one last questions, like, we're really divided in the United States. Like, not maybe more divided than we've ever been or something. We did have a civil war, but we are a very divided country. Like, why are we so darn divided about this stuff? And is there ever any hope? I mean, I guess Professor Pingle already said, like, there's going to be big government people and small government people, but like, why can there not be a consensus, or why is there no possibility of it seeming to like move toward like common definitions of like what freedom is or how we go about achieving it? Like, why are we all so, why can't we all just get along and like actually see eye to eye on stuff? I know that's an incredibly naive frame of some really, really sophisticated questions, but I'm just wondering, like, is there, like, as kind of a last one, like, is there any hope for consensus and like getting stuff done at all? I don't know who wants to jump in. I guess Julian, sure.
Yeah, well, I think the path to consensus is realizing that maybe we're capital L liberals or capital C conservatives, but at the end of the day, we're all lowercase liberals as well. We all agree that we should stay with democracy. There's obviously fringe groups on both sides that will try to push it whatever way they want it to be, whether left-wing authoritarianism or right-wing authoritarianism. But we're ignoring the fact that we really do agree on many premises. We agree that we should stay with democracy. We agree that Congress sucks. We all agree on that. We agree that, yeah, presidents can sometimes suck, as when president's in office, public opinion usually shifts away from his or her opinions. So I think what needs to be done is just tackling that perception that we cannot agree, that over there are evil people that want to abort babies and worship Marx, and over there are fascists that want to just make a homogenous society. That's not the case, and that's not what's going to be reflected when people vote on a national scale. And I think that's just what we need to move towards, is understanding that we really do have a lot in common.
I'll speak to two things. One thing we could agree on, if I use the climate science or I use economic science, even though scientists disagree, is how the world works. But if two people agree on how the world works, they still may not agree on policy because they have different values or priorities. And so I think that's why we'll always have differences. I think just developing, we've had a civil discussion here. I actually like it that people could get heated but not ugly, and make arguments rather than devolve into ad hominem attacks. I wanted to speak to the freedom thing, though, because there was a question there about it. I like the Jeffersonian notion of freedom, that if you're going to associate with someone, what do you want to be guaranteed? A free exercise of industry. To me, that means you get to choose how you want to improve your life, how you want to live your life, and you get to keep the fruits acquired by it. So I think a conservative notion is heavily tied to property. If you take Bastiat basically said there are two ways people get things: work or plunder. And so the basic role of government is to prevent plunder, I would say, from the conservative perspective. Whereas another notion of freedom is you're not free if you don't have enough income. Well, if you aren't earning enough income through your work and you have to take it from someone else, there's a natural tension there. And so I think a natural tension between modern liberals and conservatives is modern liberals are more willing to take from others, to see that everybody has a certain amount of freedom in terms of what resources can provide. And that tension will always be there. So I think it will always provide that division, but hopefully we can learn to be a little more civil in our discussion and learn from one another and understand why we're different. I think it boils down to values and priorities.
Christina, if you want to jump in, you're a theorist of deliberation. So as last thought, I guess. I don't know if that
Well, I promote deliberation and respectful exchange of discourse all the time. Just as a note for why we are so polarized in this country, a big reason is racism and the fact that we've only been a fully realized democracy for 60 years. And now that seems like it might change, which is not great. But that's where a lot of these conflicts emerge from, and our views towards government and services and policies. So I think, to me, that's kind of the big answer. But polarization, affective polarization, where we want to attack the other more than we even support our own group, is really terrible. And I hope actually talking to one another, because I think we are nice to one another when we do interact day to day, can help, heal some of that.
I love cautious optimism every once in a while. Like a good pessimistic background for some cautionary optimism is a lovely thing. Cool. Well, I guess that about does it for tonight's conversation. Those of you who stuck around an extra 7 minutes, we're grateful. And for the panelists who stuck around an extra 7 minutes, we are grateful. I want to go through a little gratitude list just to close out. I want to thank our panelists. So we got Julian Zaudke, Professor Mark Pingle, and Professor Christina Ladam. Thank you for sharing your time and insights with us during a just horrendous time of the semester. And so super, super grateful for that. Thank you so much for being here. I'd like to again thank the Core Humanities Program, the Thought on Tap Committee, the College of Liberal Arts, and Laughing Planet for their continued support. I'd like to offer a special thank you to Brett Rodriguez for doing the otherwise thankless job of orchestrating the technical and Q&A aspects of tonight's conversation. I'd also like to thank Dean Deborah Modelmog, Lisa McDonald, and Chris Stansel for their invaluable support. And finally, I want to close out by thanking y'all, the viewers, for tuning in tonight during this busy time of the semester and year. If none of this is worthwhile, if y'all don't tune in, we're so grateful to have you here. So have a great night. If you want to rewatch this,